welcome and good morning to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. If you're joining me on Instagram, hello. If you're joining me up here on YouTube, hello as well. I'm so happy that you're here. If you're new to our learning community, this is a weekly Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory with some psychoanalysis thrown in lecture that I've been hosting for the past 2.5 years. These are entirely open access, so anybody can join. It's fine if you're a complete beginner. I try to make these accessible and hopefully entertaining, but also enriching for those of you who might have a little bit more experience in your own study and learning and reading. Essentially, the basic idea is to take some of the key philosophical and theoretical concepts and to make them accessible without dumbing them down. So to retain their complexity, but hopefully do so in an entertaining fashion. Today, I'm going to be talking about Guardians of the Galaxy, Zizek's Parallax Gap, why Kant might be the first materialist thinker in disguise, the Lacanian theory of anamorphosis, and many other things along the way. So that's all going to be fitting into the next 50 minutes or so. I'd like to say briefly, if you are joining me from around the world, please do leave a comment. It makes me very, very happy to know where you are joining me from. I see Germany, Guten Morgen Deutschland, Jordan, hello Jordan. Always very, very happy to see people joining. Slovenia, hello. Singapore, that's incredible. That's amazing. Argentina, Romania, that's so wonderful. I also want to say a huge thank you to the patrons and subscribers who keep making these open access lectures possible. I'm a huge believer in the idea of open access education. I really love the notion that we can all be learning and reading and inspiring each other together. And that is really only possible due to the very generous contributions, financial and otherwise, by our patrons. So thank you to our Patreon community and our recent subscribers on Instagram. So thank you to our Instagram subscribers. If you'd like to access all of my lectures, which by now include more than 100 hours of lectures, as audio downloads, please go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian, where you can also access edited transcripts for each and every lecture, my ebook introduction to Slavoj Žižek's work called And Yet It Moves, 5 Lessons on Žižek, and lots more. If you'd like daily bite-sized mini tutorials, so-called micro-learning, which I've been posting to Instagram, please consider becoming a subscriber on Instagram. Plus, you'll be able to access a weekly Q&A live stream that I record after this lecture. So on behalf of everybody, including myself, thank you to our patrons and thank you to the subscribers who keep this project possible and on the road. You may also have noticed that I've reshelved some books, so it's a slightly different backdrop. Every once in a while, I try to clean up a little bit and move things around and make space for new books. So every once in a while, we have a slightly different backdrop. Okay, let's begin. Make yourself comfortable. We're going to be going for 45 minutes or so. As a general rule of thumb, I believe that one can gain more philosophical insight from seemingly not serious movies, action movies, popular movies, comic book movies, Marvel movies, that one can gain more philosophical insight from these seemingly trivial movies than one can from some of the great serious classics. Case in point, I was recently watching Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, we see what is arguably the best example of the Kantian critical framework, Kant's so-called critical transcendentalism. Now, towards the end of the film, very minor spoilers here, we hear the character Groot, who in all the other films has only uttered the words, "I am Groot." This is his universal utterance, his response to everything. "I am Groot" can mean many different things, but it is the singular utterance that he has. "I am Groot," the declarative statement. In one of the final scenes of the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie, we suddenly hear Groot speaking in English, which is sort of discombobulating after not hearing him speak English, or at least not hearing him say anything other than "I am Groot" for several hours. He says, "I love you guys." Now, later, and thank you to someone online who brought this to my attention, the director James Gunn said that The reason that Groot doesn't say I am Groot, but instead says I love you guys, is not, in fact, because Groot has suddenly decided to speak English or to say something else. It is because the viewer, by means of having watched 3 Guardians of the Galaxy movies, has become part of the family of the Guardians, and therefore can now understand what Groot has been saying all along. In other words, that in order to not simply hear I am Groot, but to hear real utterances, semantic meaning, one has to be a member of the Guardians as such. Now, here we have the classic philosophical transition from in itself to for itself. Another way of saying this is that what happens with I am Groot is precisely not that there is an, or let me put it like this. What happens with the I am Groot transition from I am Groot to I love you guys is that what appears to be an epistemological shift in understanding is in fact an ontological one, a shift in the nature of being as such. In other words, it is not that Groot has changed. It is that you have changed, that your reality has changed. You've become a member of the family, and therefore you can now interpret what is being said by Groot. Hence, what appears, once again, what appears as a mere epistemological shift, in fact, masks an ontic shift. A shift in understanding reveals a shift in being itself. Now, here we actually have the very fundamental mechanism of the Kantian critical transcendental inquiry, which is to say, to what extent is the subject, or to what extent does the subject have to be counted in to the frame of reality itself? In other words, it's the shift from saying that it is not what counts what lies beyond reality, namely the transcendental, beyond, but instead the incompleteness that lies within reality itself is what Kant is interested in. How the subject himself creates or stitches together reality. That's something that we're going to look into a little bit here. Now, this shift from in itself to for itself, the shift from epistemological change to an ontic change, the shift from I am Groot to I love you guys, is what the philosopher Slavoj Žižek refers to as a parallax gap. And a parallax gap, the basic definition of a parallax gap is when something appears to change against a neutral backdrop depending on the subjective point of view. I can give you a couple of examples of this. The classic Lacanian example is to use anamorphosis. Anamorphosis is like an optic illusion, whereby depending on where you stand when you look at something, the thing itself appears to change. The classic example that Lacan uses is the portrait called The Ambassadors, which if you live in London, you can actually go to the National Gallery and you can see it there in its full splendor. In The Ambassadors, we have a portrait of 2 bourgeois subjects, sort of royally clad, signifying great status and wealth. It's one of those Golden Age style paintings. And yet, at the bottom of the painting, there appears to be something that looks almost like a stain, like a smudge, sort of a blurry image. And if you look at it from the correct angle, in other words, if you look at it from askance, so not directly from the front, it emerges that this blur, the stain, is in fact the skull. Here we have an anamorphosic illusion, or an anamorphic illusion, which is that you cannot see it correctly when you look at the painting straight up. You see it correctly when you look at the painting in the wrong way. In other words, rather than there being a neutral frame of the painting, the subjective stance of the viewer, the gaze, has to be counted into the picture itself. Now, of course, there's an ironic meta element here as well, which is that if we interpret, as one usually does in classical portraiture, the elements in the painting as being signifiers, or in other words, symbols, for example, like you could have scales signifying justice, you could argue that to have a blurred skull that only appears to you from a certain angle is a kind of memento mori, a kind of reflection upon death. And here we can have some historical speculation on the nature of the portrait. Was it simply something that was added as an ironic gesture? Or, as historical evidence suggests, the portrait was actually hung at the top of a flight of stairs, so that when you were coming round the stairs, you would actually see the skull before you saw the portrait. It's a beautiful example of anamorphosis. Now, the Lacanian insight here, and this is why Lacan's interested in it, is of course that, strictly speaking, there's therefore no objective neutral way of observing the portrait in its correct way. Instead, the very way of viewing the portrait incorrectly, in other words, the subjective stance that has to be brought into the painting, is what reveals its truth. Here we have, again, a Kantian suggestion, which is that the Kantian inquiry is never to say we can observe objective reality neutrally. Instead, the Kantian question is always to say, how are we already presupposing reality? How is it that when we look at reality, the very way in which we conceptualize reality is already constitutive to the very thing that we are trying to reason with? Here, one of the misconceptions about Kant here is that Kant is simply a kind of transcendental pessimist who says, well, we can't know reality. We can't know reality in and of itself. It's this, mystical transcendental horizon that lies beyond the world of reason. And while there's certainly an element of that in Kant, a much more poignant question for Kant is, how does this question pose itself in the first place? How does the question of reality, or the question of objective reality, present itself to us conceptually, i.e. through reason? There's an example that I use here sometimes, which is an old anecdote about a judge who, when was asked to define pornography, said that he couldn't define pornography, but that he knew it when he sees it. Here we have essentially the Kantian critical mechanism again. Kant's question wouldn't be, what is pornography? Kant's question would be, how is it that when pornography is presented to me, do I know it? In other words, the question for Kant is never, what is the essence of something? The question of Kant is, what is the pre-framework, the pre-mediation that has to occur conceptually in order for something to be presented to me as given or as knowable? In other words, I know it when I see it. That is what Kant's interested in. What makes you know it when you see it? Now, there's a couple of elements that I want to add here because, we're going pretty fast here. But the central principle here is that there is a shift that occurs between the idea of an incompleteness that lies beyond reality towards the incompleteness of reality itself. And this shift is what Zizek has described as a parallax gap. And we can find a parallax gap, for example, in psychoanalysis. One of the easiest ways to understand the idea of a parallax gap is in the transition from desire to drive. Now, desire is, for example, if you're trying to do something. Let's say you're trying to accomplish something and you're failing repeatedly at it. Drive, on the other hand, is as soon as you start secretly enjoying your very failure to accomplish the thing. In other words, the transition from desire to drive is once the lack within desire itself, in other words, the failure to complete something, becomes its own animating principle. As soon as you start enjoying your own failure, as soon as you start relishing in the process without relishing the completion, you have therefore accomplished the transition from desire to drive. In other words, desire is the kind of undead, empty, uncanny mechanism that lies within desire itself. It is not the horizon that lies beyond the realm of desire. It is that which is sustains precisely within the incompleteness of desire as such. Here we have again the parallax gap, or the parallax shift. The transition from desire, namely I want X in order to be happy, towards drive, I am happy in not achieving X, is therefore the parallax that exists. It's not the gap between desire and drive. It is the immanence of drive within the incompleteness of the ontological, if you will, horizon of desire as such. Actually, I'm going to interrupt myself very quickly. My cat is at the door, and my cat would really like to be let outside. So let's have a brief interruption here and save this poor cat. Tom. Oh no, he's decided against it. Hi, Tom. Let's see if we can find Tom. Tom, you can come out. Poor thing, he was pawing at the door. He desperately wanted out. until I decided to let him out. We didn't want to. Come on. Yeah. It's okay. Yeah. All right, we're gonna say hello to everybody. Hello. Hello, and we're gonna let you out. Yeah. Okay, I am back. Thank you very much. Okay, let us continue. Apologies for the interruption. And so here we have something which Zizek, the philosopher, Slavoj Zizek, calls the parallax gap. And the parallax gap is therefore not the gap between things, but it is the gap that is immanent to the one itself. In Hegelian terms, this would be called self-relating negativity. And Zizek actually has a really, I think, a very intuitive example about this, which he repeats in a lot of his books and lectures. And he talks about the difference between American and European architecture, specifically the difference between what is known as the ground floor in America and the first floor in Europe. Now, Zizek essentially puts it like this. He says, in the United States, the ground floor is the first floor. In other words, when you enter into a hotel, the lobby, that is the first floor. Whereas in Europe, when you enter into a building, where the zero-sum level that you enter at, the lobby, is in fact the floor 0. And the first floor is when you go up one flight of stairs. In other words, American hotels begin with the number 1, the first floor, whereas a European hotel would begin with the number 0, and you would ascend to the first floor. Now, Zizek has an interesting anecdote. He says that he was in a hotel in Poland, and he observed that Poland actually had mediated between the European and the American model, where Zizek said that he was in the elevator and he realized that instead of going from 0 to 1, the elevator simply went from 0 to 2. And he asked one of the members of staff at the hotel how they could explain this. How did it go from 0 to 2? What had happened to the 1? And he said that the person working at the hotel gave him a beautifully intuitive answer, which was, he said, well, if you're going to start with 0, then you have to count 0 as 1. And so it makes sense to go from 0 to 2. And Zizek says that here in the Polish hotel system, where you go from 0 to 2, where you don't count the 1, essentially, or you count the 0 as 1, we have the essential formula of the parallax shift, of the Hegelian self-relating negativity, or the transition from desire to drive. Namely, something which is counted as nothing, or to put it more, perhaps even more Hegelian, we have nothing counted as something. In other words, it's not simply the transition from 0 to 1, it is that 0 itself is counted as 1, hence the transition from 0 to 2. Now, the reason that this is important for Zizek is that this transition, therefore, is strictly speaking a dialectical reflection that lies within 0 as such. Let me try to explain that a little bit. If you're talking about dialectics, specifically dialectical materialism, there are two things that you should always avoid. One, you should avoid seeing dialectics as the mere linear progression. It's not simply that we have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and that we're all sort of moving forward, and that we continuously have the unity of opposites where two things clash and something new emerges. This is like almost like a Maoist reductionist idea that antagonism is the central truth of all historical progression, etc. That is the first thing to avoid. Instead, dialectics is never about linear progression. Instead, it is about immanent progression. It is the contradictions that are unfolding that are immanent to the internal limit of the thing itself. I'll return to that in a moment. The second thing to avoid is what you might call the colonization or the popularization of a kind of dialectical unity of opposites in terms of yin and yang and balance, and we need to have light and we need to have dark, etc., and that everything kind of comes into the middle. This is the weirdly contemporary New Age centrism of dialectics, to simply imply that everything exists on a spectrum and that if the universe is in balance, everything will be fine, etc. That's not how you should approach the idea of dialectics. So if you're avoiding those two ideas of the dialect, if you're avoiding the idea of linear progression, and if you're avoiding the idea of a kind of yin-yang unity of opposites, How should you approach the idea of dialectics? Well, I was recently watching a movie that has a really good example of this. It's George Miller's latest film. I think it's called like 3,000 Years of Longing or something like that. And there's a great little joke in this movie, which is the perfect illustration of dialectics. We have three men who are in a boat. Three men who are in a ship. They're stranded on a boat. And a genie appears to them. And he says, I will grant you 3 wishes. You can have 1 wish each. And the first man says, well, I'd like to be with my family. The second man says, I would like to be with my work. I'd like to be back at work. They both disappear. Poof, poof. They're gone. One man is remaining in the ship, and he says, I would like to be with my friends. And then poof, poof, the men appear back in the boat, and the 3 men are stranded once again. Now, apart from this being one of those classic like genie trickster jokes, we have here essentially the unfolding of the dialectic, which is that, strictly speaking, the 3 men are in the exact same position that they were in when they began. However, in order to be in that place, a fundamental shift had to occur. Namely, 2 of them had to leave, and the third one had to wish for them to return. So the question, therefore, the key question is, what was introduced by this negativity? Is anything new here, or is everything strictly speaking the same? Well, from a Hegelian perspective, everything is gained in this situation and nothing is lost. In other words, in the transition from a dialectical foundation, a beginning point towards the self-relating negativity, the mediation by which the 3 men are in the boat once again, what appears to be the same is in fact the entire dialectical unfolding of a certain synthesis. The same is true when it comes to historical or dialectical materialism. The unity of opposites is never simply the manner in which we have 2 things fighting against each other and some higher necessity emerging in some kind of vulgar Darwinian sense. Instead, the idea of the unity of opposites is precisely, to put it in the terms of Visconti, how everything has to change in order for everything to remain the same. That the dialectical unfolding of history for Hegel is precisely that the unitary tract of history, the linear unfolding of history, is therefore never simply a linear movement, but precisely a dialectical one. Or to put it in the terms of Günter Grass, the famous German author, it is a crab walk, a Krebsgang. It is moving sideways as a means of moving forward. In other words, the dialectical movement is never simply a contest between 2 mediations that then result in some form of higher synthesis, but rather the way in which everything that appears to you as objective, unmediated reality is itself always already dialectically mediated. In other words, the negation is not between things, the negation is entirely immanent. That is the best way to approach the idea of the dialectic, namely, not the unity of opposites in a kind of vulgar yin-yang sense, nor the idea of a linear progression of history, but rather that everything that appears to you as supposedly outside the dialectical unfolding is itself always already immanently, self-relatingly, dialectically mediated. That is the Hegelian insight. Now, if we take this idea of the gap, and thank you if you're still with me. I know we're doing a lot, but I think these are all sort of important pieces. If we take this idea of the dialectic and the idea of the parallax gap, we can also apply it to, again, to return to the idea of Lacanian anamorphosis. Now, as I mentioned before, the Lacanian anamorphosis is the idea that the subject has to be counted into the supposedly neutral frame of reality as such. In other words, here we have almost like Kant avec Lacan, if you will, which is that for Kant, the question is never, how does reality appear to me? But what has to occur in advance in order for reality to appear as reality? In other words, the I know it when I see it, the question is not what is it, what are the formal attributes of the content of reality, but instead, what has to occur in advance for reality to present itself to me in the form of conceptual reason in the first place. And from a Lacanian perspective, we have something very similar that happens, which is that Lacan essentially says, if the subject is that which sustains reality. In other words, if reality is not simply the objective thing that happens to the subject, if instead reality is only accessed through fantasy, in other words, that reality is dialectically stitched together through subjectivity, then isn't this also retroactively true for the subject? What is the founding ground, the ontological horizon of the subject as such? In other words, what does it mean to be subject? After all, we can't simply make a kind of parallax shift by which we take the ontological incompleteness and we posit it in reality, but then we uphold it in the subject. That would make no sense. And so instead we have to argue that the subject's incompleteness, which is what Lacan calls the barred subject, which I'll return to in a moment, is therefore constitutive to the very nature of reality itself. Now, before we succumb to some kind of mysticism where we say that there is no reality except for your own subjective interpretations, a kind of absolute relativism, the monstrous boogeyman of conservative criticisms of postmodernism in which anything can be everything, the point for Lacan is precisely that it is not that everything can be anything. The point, on the other hand, is that reality has to be sustained by fantasy, and that the only way to sustain reality is through subjective investment, i.e. through fantasy. And what is the fundamental fantasy? Well, for Lacan, the fundamental fantasy is precisely the idea of objective reality. This is how you have to understand the Lacanian idea of traversing the fundamental fantasy. If the fundamental fantasy is the idea of an objective neutral horizon of ontic reality that can be accessed neutrally by the subject, this is precisely how you are living in the ultimate fantasy. And so to traverse this fantasy is to say, I reject the idea of a pre-given, ontologically complete frame, neutral reality that I can access as a seemingly neutral subject. Instead, I have to accept the fact that reality is always pre-mediated or pre-constituted through subjectivity itself. In other words, the Lacanian idea of the barred subject isn't simply a kind of pseudo-pop wisdom about the fact that it's so difficult to be one thing, that you can wear multiple masks, etc. Instead, the Lacanian argument is that you are your mask, that there is no truth underneath the mask, but that truth lies within the mask as such. But what's crucial here is that, once again, this is not simply a pop psychological truism about how, there is no true self, etc. Instead, Lacan is quite consistent here, and this is why Zizek is so important in applying Lacan to Kant and Hegel. The consistency here is that this gap, this ontological incompleteness that lies within the subject, is mirrored on the ontic level of substance as such. In other words, that in the exact same manner in which the subject's completeness lies within his incompleteness, in other words, the only universal is absolute differentiation as such, the immanent differentiation from within, the same is therefore transposed into the absolute, or into the idea of substance or essence. In other words, the only completeness, the only thing that makes substance universal is precisely its irreducibility to a universal substance as such. And the name of this gap, the name of the gap, the self-relating negativity that lies within substance as such, is of course subjectivity. That is like the punchline for Zizek, which is to say that subject is therefore not the neutral observer of absolute reality, but subject is that which is the universalized incompleteness within substance as such. In other words, the gap between substance and subject is therefore transposed into subject itself, therefore mirroring the ontological a priori gap within substance. This is, as I've said before, this is Zizek's Hegelian ontology. It is that the fall from substance, rather than being something in which something is lost, is in fact something through which everything is gained. That the ontic proposition that Zizek has is therefore that essence emerges only through the fall into appearance. And so subject, therefore, rather than being the neutral arbiter of absolute essence, subject is precisely the kind of symbolized, physical, materialized failure of that which has to fall from within substance as such. And for those of you who are a little bit more interested in metaphysics, Zizek's argument, therefore, is that we have here a what he calls a post-metaphysical materialism, or transcendental materialism, if you will, which is that essentially Zizek appears to be arguing for a return to Hegelian idealism, speculative transcendentalism, etc. But what he's really doing is actually the exact opposite. He's not arguing for a mystical, solipsistic idea of the absolute or the Platonic form by which subject is a mere automata that's following the unfolding dialectical motion of history and reason. It's really quite the opposite. Instead, he's arguing precisely for the idea of a materialism that is a properly dialectical materialism. Now, what is a properly dialectical materialism? Let me try to put this very simply. The central aspect of materialism is precisely not that the subject stands neutrally outside reality and can observe it empirically, scientifically, etc. The central aspect of dialectical materialism is that the subject has to count himself into his own frame. And here we can see why Kant is, in a sense, a dialectical materialist avant la lettre. Because, as I said before, the Kantian so-called critical transcendental framework asks this question. It doesn't ask, what do we need to know in order to know things in itself? How do we access the transcendental horizon of absolute truth, etc.? It's a simplified version of Kant. Instead, what Kant is asking is, how does reason itself tarnish or muddy the waters of the absolute? In other words, if the absolute has to be made accessible through reason, we conceptualize the idea of the absolute, do we thereby tarnish it? Do we thereby dilute it? And of course, the Kantian framework is never simply that between pure absolute reason and impure absolute reason. It's precisely the opening up of the possibility that the pure conditions of absolute reasons are thereby precisely delineated by their fall into the impure of conceptual reason. Hence, Kant's critique of pure reason has to be understood very literally. Pure reason is an impossibility. It's a complete oxymoron. If the pure is that which exists outside the horizon of reason, in other words, the outside, the idea of concepts and things in the world, then as soon as reason is part of it, as soon as you conceptualize the absolute, it is thereby already no longer pure. And so Kant's critique of pure reason is thereby precisely his argument that maybe there is no such thing as pure absolute form without the mediation into reason. It's a very radical argument. It's the reason why Kant was so famous. If Kant simply had argued that, there's a transcendental ontic substance that we cannot access and it lies in the objects themselves, the things in themselves, and we have the antinomies, which means that we can't really think them. It's almost like Kant would be essentially telling you to go home because you might as well give up on the idea of reaching absolute transcendental truths. But that's not Kant. Kant's idea is much more radical than that, which is to say, what if the very absoluteness of essence, substance, is precisely that it has to be mediated through subjective reason? That it has to be accessed through the subject, that the ontological incompleteness is therefore not what lies beyond substance, but is embedded within substance as such. And it's really only because of Kant that we can then have Hegel, because Hegel simply draws out some of the more radical conclusions. The funny thing about Kant is that the way that you can tell that Kant and the Kantian inquiry into pure reason is a genuine revolution in human thought is all the hysterical responses it evokes, whereby people try to sort of evade the fundamental core of the Kantian insight. Think about Fichte and Ich-Philosophie, to say, well, if we can't access the substance, we should engage in pure, engagement with subjectivity, that everything is posited by the I, the Ich in German, that everything is simply a subjective emanation. Here, ironically, in Fichte, as much as I like Fichte, we actually have a return to some of the sophism from the pre-Socratics. Remember, the sophists, the pre-Socratics, weren't simply selling the idea of rhetoric and philosophy as a kind of trade. They were specifically arguing something much more radically, which we've forgotten today, which is that everything you say is literally how reality is constituted. Like one of the sophist maxims was that to say the word carriage made that there would literally be a carriage that came out of your mouth. And I say that and you're like, well, how could they believe that a carriage would literally come out of your mouth? But it's actually very close to some of today's more postmodern attitudes to semantics, which is to say that if you speak it, you are willing it into existence. In other words, does carriage truly exist before you've said it, before you've spoken it? And of course, Discursive strategies today and discursive critiques have pointed out exactly how the way in which we speak things and the names we give to them is precisely always subject to structural power mechanisms, etc. And so the point of the sophist, therefore, which is a radical emphasis on subjective creation, if you will, I speak it, therefore it exists, is what we see then returning in another guise through the Fichtean Ich-Philosophie, the I philosophy. But the Ich-Philosophie has to be understood as a totally hysterical reaction to the Kantian problem. If the Kantian problem is the irreducible reality, or sorry, the irreducible nature between substance and subject, between absolute essence and subjective appearances, then the Fichtean response is to hysterically posit that, well, everything is subjective, that everything has to be rendered through the subjective lens. In contrast to this, we can see the other side of the coin, which is, of course, therefore, Schellingian absolute idealism, Naturphilosophie, or natural philosophy, which is to posit the idea of an absolute substance and essence that lies completely behind a barrier that we cannot access. It is around us all the time. It's almost like a mystical Christian attitude towards the idea of the absolute. Whereas for Plato, the absolute, truth, etc., pure form, lay outside the cave, and we're all distracted by the illusions, the shadows cast on the cave wall. For Schelling, it was very much that the essence was all around us all the time, that it is with us right now, that we cannot see it, but it is constantly lurking around us. And so here we have the two sides of the same hysterical response to Kant. Namely, on the one hand, the dive into absolute subjectivity, namely Fichtean Ich-Philosophie, and then we have the Schellingian absolute into mystical Naturphilosophie, etc. Although, I mentioned this in the previous lecture series, here we also should not reduce Schelling to this mere category of idiot hysterics. Fichte is a little bit more like that, but Schelling is a little bit more interesting. Remember, Schelling's argument is der nie vergehende Rest, the indivisible remainder, which is to say that Schelling is interested in something which is nevertheless therefore irreducible in this idea of substance that lies all around us. And if you look at the Hegelian argument about sublation, in German Aufhebung, which for those of you who know a little bit about Hegel, the idea of sublation has three interpretations, namely Aufheben, to lift something up, to transcend it, Aufheben, to save something for later, and then also Aufhebung, to resolve something like a mathematical formula. Well, then you can see that the Schellingian argument, der nie aufgehende Rest, aufgehen has two meanings in German. One, something which opens, like a mouth, my mouth is opening, or something aufgehen, which is something coming undone. Something is like actually, this is where I've made this too confusing. The Hegelian Aufhebung is actually not the resolving of a formula, but to declare something void, like Aufhebung, like to declare a law void. Whereas the Schellingian idea is that we have something that opens up, aufgehen, and then we have also something aufgehen like a mathematical formula. Anyway, I've successfully made this way harder than it needs to be. My central point, however, is that the Hegelian idea of dialectical sublation is therefore precisely not the transcendental movement of linear progression towards a new form, but an engagement with what Schelling posits as the irreducible remainder of the absolute. If for Schelling, the absolute, mystical Naturphilosophie is all around us all the time, it never opens and it never resolves, it's just perpetually there, it is almost like a Lacanian real. Hegel's argument, therefore, is precisely that what appears to Schelling as an irreducible mystical absolute is not beyond the world of subject, but immanent to subjective reality as such. That the Hegelian sublation, the Hegelian dialectic, Aufhebung, is therefore precisely an attempt, highly successfully, to reconcile the Fichtean and Schellingian positions, and therefore to retroactively propose a solution to the Kantian problematic. If Kant's problem is, how is the absolute made impure through reason, is therefore the idea of the absolute irreducible to reason, and the Fichtean response is to dive into absolute idealism of the subject, and then the Schellingian response is to dive into the absolute idealization of the absolute, the Hegelian response is to simply take these two seemingly irreducible features and to merge them. Substance equals subject. The Hegelian aphorism. And what's funny here is that Hegel is very anti-wisdom, like Hegel's very much like Socrates here. Remember, Plato said that Socrates was like a midwife of reason, that he was barren of wisdom, that he could not himself conceive of wisdom, that he could only help others conceive of it themselves. Here we can see Hegel being the midwife of reason. Rather than coming up with this supposedly solipsistic, all-explanatory theory of reality, which is how a lot of people tend to sort of reduce Hegel into some kind of mystical nonsense, Hegel was very specifically looking at a gauntlet that was thrown down by Kant and then picked up by Fichte and Schelling, and he is reconciling them. He is not completely breaking them apart. He's actually stitching them together. And historically, this even makes sense because all of this happened in Jena. Like, let's remember for a moment that the university at Jena was the predominant cultural factory of some of the key revolutions in philosophical and human thought. The fact that Kant was visited by Fichte, and that Fichte then ended up teaching at Jena, Schelling ended up teaching at Jena, that Schelling invited Hegel to come to Jena, and that once Fichte and Schelling had already left, Hegel was still in Jena writing his famous works, and that his works were then spirited away as Napoleon invaded Jena. Here we see what can really only be described as a remarkable, constellation of philosophical necessity, all concentrated in one point. It's one of the absolutely mind-boggling things about the history of philosophy is that it really doesn't move in a kind of gradual linear trajectory. We have these bursts of pure creativity that seem to launch philosophy into totally new trajectories that come seemingly all at once within the span of just like 50 years or so. It's truly remarkable. Okay, I'm gonna try to wrap up here. So to recap briefly, I started with Guardians of the Galaxy and the transition from what appears to be an epistemological shift is in fact an ontic shift. To put that more simply, when the I am Groot character no longer says I am Groot, but says I love you guys, we have what appears to be an epistemological shift, namely, why is he suddenly saying something I can understand, towards the realization that the reason you can understand it is not because Groot has changed, it is because you have changed. It is because you are now part of the family. In other words, that something has happened and that the way in which you are subjectively imbuing the nature of the frame has changed the frame itself. This is the Kantian metaphysical critical proposition in much more accessible form, the shift from epistemological to ontic reality. Namely, the way in which what appears to you subjectively, in other words, epistemology, the interpretation of reality, is itself constitutive to reality. In other words, the ontic nature of reality as such. That the subject is like someone who dips their finger into the pond of reality and that the ripples therefore change reality itself. Of course, the more radical implication is therefore that reality doesn't lie beyond subjective horizon, but that reality lies within the subjective horizon as such. In other words, that they're irreducible to each other. This is what Zizek calls the parallax gap, namely not the gap between things, but the gap immanent to the thing itself, which he also calls nothing counted as something. The psychoanalytic example of that can be seen in the transition from desire to drive. Desire is I want X. And once you start failing to achieve or acquire X, and you start enjoying your own failure, you start repeating it, you have made the transition from desire to drive. In other words, the loss of the object becomes its own gain. This constitutive negativity, therefore, means that drive does not lie beyond desire, but lies immanently, like some undead, uncanny emanation, within the failure, the incompleteness of desire as such. Now, the connection between the psychoanalytic principle of desire to drive can therefore be found precisely within subject to substance. That the incompleteness of the subject, what Lacan calls the barred subject, is therefore constitutive negatively to the idea of the substance, the absolute ontic reality as such. Therefore, for Zizek, the Lacanian idea of anamorphosis, the idea that the subject has to be counted into the frame of his own appearance, can be found also within Hegelian Kantian ontology. I'm summarizing, I just spent an hour trying to explain some of these ideas. This means that if you want to understand the dialectical attribute of Hegelian philosophy and its relationship to Kant, You have to understand that the dialectic is never simply the unity of opposites in some vulgar New Age yin and yang kind of way in which everything comes at peace once the universe is in balance, nor for that matter is it the linear forward transition progress. It's not simply saying we have thesis, antithesis, and then it resolves in synthesis, and then we start from the beginning, and so on and so forth. Instead, the dialectic is the immanent self-relating negativity that contributes to the appearance of the one as complete as such. In other words, the gap between substance and subject is itself substance. Rather than seeing subject as the irreducible barrier towards substance, which is what Kant essentially argued, it is exactly the other way around. Where Kant appears to close the door, Hegel sees only an opening. Namely, what appears to be the barrier to the metaphysical proposition of the absolute is in fact its own solution. That subject, rather than being the antithesis that bars us from the absolute, is in fact the antithesis that realizes the absolute. In other words, the synthesis between absolute and subject, between substance and subject, does not resolve into some higher other form, but instead lies precisely within substance itself. Substance was always already mediated by subjectivity, by the subjective investment. Now, to conclude, and this will lead us into next week's session as we start engaging more with dialectical materialism, one thing we should avoid here is the argument that everything is complete, that there's a kind of perfect congruence between substance and subject, because then we risk falling into another kind of Hegelian mysticism that we don't want, where essence reveals itself through the subject and the subject realizes essence, and you end up with some kind of pop vulgar truism about, essence lies within, etc. Instead, this gap, this irreducible self-relating negativity, is always incomplete. In fact, to put it almost in Lacanian terms, its only completeness is its incompleteness. Its only universal nature is its absolute difference. It raises difference to the level of the absolute and therefore can never be fully reconciled. It is always out of joint. Subject is therefore not what completes essence or completes reality. Subject is what remains out of joint with reality. It's precisely the irreducible kind of remainder that is in subject. I'm not explaining this very well, but we can do that next week. In other words, subject is not the solution to substance. Subject is the problem of substance. There's always some excessive remainder. There's something that cannot be dialectically mediated. In fact, the very mechanism of the dialectic is therefore precisely not the natural gradual unfolding by which everything fits. It's precisely that there's always something which does not fit. There's always something that lies outside the horizon of incompleteness. Because this is the trap we have to be aware of. If you raise incompleteness to the ontological level of absolute, like the only thing complete is incompleteness, etc., you risk succumbing to a kind of false relativism by which incompleteness and completeness are simply synonymous and nothing escapes it. And we're stuck in the cliche of the monstrous necessity of the unfolding of reason, which is attributed often to Hegel and Marx. Instead, the argument is more nuanced, which is to say that in this dialectic between the universal and the particular, between substance and subject, there is always something excessive. There's always something which escapes. There's always something which is irreducible to the universal as such. And this, to put it in Marxist terms, is the revolutionary category. Or to put it Badiouian terms, this is the category of truth. That we always have to be on the hunt for this excessive third thing that is not a priori in any sense, but exists only as the result of the irreducible tension that is not beyond the horizon of subject or substance, but lies within subject and substance as such. And this irreducible tension is precisely what moves history forward. This, therefore, is the unity of opposites. Not that we have a reconciliation of two seemingly antagonistic propositions, but that there is always an internal limit to the universal as such. In other words, that the universal is not contrasted by its particular exception, but that the universal contains within itself its own particular exception, which therefore drives further contradiction. I know this is very abstract and very difficult, but I'll give you like a Hegelian example here. One of the arguments that Hegel makes is about the universal nature of law. For example, law versus crime. And Hegel argues that law is not the opposite of crime. It's not that we have crime and we have law. Instead, law is universalized crime. Now, that's not very intuitive, so there's a couple layers that you have to explain here. One, Hegel's argument is seemingly, and this is the intuitive way to explain it, although not entirely correct, that crime therefore only exists because of law. Think about it. If crime is itself a category of law, if you didn't have law, you wouldn't have crime, right? A crime means that you have broken the law. And so if there is no law, then technically there can be no crime. In the same way that if you don't have marriage, then there can be no like sex outside of marriage, for example, right? That is the more intuitive but not entirely accurate interpretation of Hegel, which is there would be no law if there weren't any crime, because before you know it, you're in some kind of like, anarchist argument about the fact that we shouldn't have laws because then we wouldn't have crime, etc. The more important Hegelian argument is that law is not simply that which conjures or brings about crime, but that law is universalized crime. In other words, that law is itself the exception to the universal law of reality. That law is a strictly speaking symbolic imposition upon what appear to be the neutral groundings of reality. This is like the anarchist position again, is who are you to impose your law on me? Who made you king? Who made you judge and jury and executioner, etc.? And the Hegelian argument, which is therefore slightly conservative, of course, is precisely to argue that law therefore takes crime, which is the exception to the rule of nature, and universalizes it into the rule of law. In other words, into the symbolic framework through which we access reality. However, the key thing to be avoided here is not to argue that Hegel says, oh, we should make a return to natural, correspondence with nature and your inner urges, and we should go back to nature and live in a less alienated way, etc. Hegel argues that nothing is lost in this transition from nature into law. That in this universalized crime into the symbolic order of justice and laws and legal frameworks and power, everything is gained. That subjectivity, therefore, is precisely the unnatural participation in law as universalized crime against nature as such. That your participation in unnatural legal reality, socio-symbolic reality, is therefore precisely your natural state. Here we can ironically see a link between Hegel and Aristotle, because Aristotle's famous argument is that man is a political animal, that what characterizes man is precisely that man acts naturally by exiting nature or not being in nature. We see something similar in Hegel, which is to say that man's true or rightful position is therefore precisely not to exist in the natural order of things, but to go into the law, the socio-symbolic organization of state and power, in which law is universalized crime. Law is itself the universal exception. Of course, for those of you who are a little bit more interested in Marxism, we can see here also the Proudhonian element of it, which is that the classic slogan that property equals theft. That theft is not to take away from someone's property, but that property itself is simply universalized theft. You have to see that this is related to the idea of the Hegelian universalized crime as well. So here we have essentially all the building blocks that we need to move forward. We have the idea of Zizek's parallax gap, namely the way in which the appearance of something, of objects in the world, shifts according to our subjective stance onto them. In other words, the way in which we view them actually makes them appear differently. The Lacanian idea of the anamorphosic shift or gap between the subject and that which the subject creates or mediates through the subjective gaze, also known as the transition from desire to drive, namely the transition from wanting X to wanting the loss of X as its own positive property. The way in which Zizek relates the Lacanian psychoanalytic parallax between desire and drive back to the ontic parallax between the Kantian metaphysical frame and the Hegelian metaphysical frame, and the beginnings, which we will continue next week, the beginnings of Zizek's interpretation of dialectical materialism. Because one of the things that people often miss is that Zizek isn't simply saying we should go back to Hegel and back to Kant. He's using Lacan to go back to Hegel and back to Kant in order to reframe dialectical materialism or the history of philosophy. That is Zizek's entire enterprise, which we're going to engage with a little bit more next week. On that note, I know this has been a very technical session, but I hope that you found little nuggets here and there that can help you and assist you in your own reading and study and further exploration of philosophy. It has been my absolute pleasure to share this hour with you. I'm going to be hosting a 1-hour Q&A session starting in about 5 or 10 minutes on Discord and Instagram. So if you are a patron, please feel free to join us on Discord. If you are an Instagram subscriber, please feel free to join us on the Instagram live stream, which is going to be starting in about 10 minutes. Until then, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and I will see you soon. Thank you guys. I'll see you later.